Are you a thoughtful leader? Maybe you are. Maybe you think you are. Let's find out. I'm Mindy Gibbins-Klein. I'm author of The Thoughtful Leader and host of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. Thoughtful leadership is all about thought leadership that goes above and beyond. Thought leadership that is truly new and original, exciting, disruptive, maybe even groundbreaking. Because let's face it, we need to raise the bar. My guests and I are absolutely obsessed with finding truly original thought leadership, and I'm going to bring you so many exciting ideas and opportunities, things for you to think about, and chances for you to push your thinking that you'll be very glad you tuned in. So thanks so much for checking out Thoughtful Leadership and the Thoughtful Leader podcast. I look forward to connecting with you very, very soon. Welcome to the show. My guest today is the amazing thoughtful leader, Mike Jones. You are in for a treat. I don't want to spoil the surprise. The only other surprise, of course, if you're watching the video instead of listening, you'll notice my hair's a bit different. And this is in honor of Mike coming on to the show because he's a bit of a risk taker. And, I thought, let me take a risk, not a big one, just changed my hair. But anyway, hello, Mike.
Hey, Mindy, good to be here.
It's great to get you on the show finally. So I know everybody can read your bio, they can read the show notes, but what would you like to say to our listeners of the Thoughtful Leader podcast?
Well, I'm just grateful to be here. I mean, I have quite a small team. I've run big teams as well. And I think sometimes this idea of being a leader, for me at least, it feels kind of weird because I just feel like I'm part of a team, but maybe the guy that has to make some of the decisions and the tough ones sometimes. And so that's very much how I think about it. So it's great to be invited onto something like this. And it's just made me really think about, well, what is a thoughtful leader? And am I a thoughtful leader? Hopefully I am. But just that in and of itself, I thought it's a great title for a podcast, I think.
Well, I copied it from the title of one of my flagship books. So it's not completely original, but it's in keeping with what I think is important. And you've hit the nail on the head, Mike, because a lot of leaders, true thoughtful leaders, they're not coming from a place of ego. It's not all about them. And we get that with you. And I'm sure the listeners will begin to understand you and your philosophy a bit. But it is important because people do look up to you when you're the founder of a business. So I'd like you to embrace that for the next 20 minutes or so while we're talking. And, don't be afraid to show that you are a leader. So your philosophy about life and work, and we ask some big questions here. What would you like to share based on your experience?
Wow, it's such a big question, that, isn't it? Such a big question. I think there's a few things. I mean, I suppose one of my kind of core philosophies, core beliefs is that, I just have this urgency, this feeling that our time on this planet is so short and finite that it's super important that we make absolutely the most of every single moment that we have. And I think that goes for me and my team and any businesses and anything we do. And I think certainly any projects that I look to get involved in, that thought process really is, how is this what we want to be doing right now? And is this going to bring something to our lives that we otherwise couldn't get doing something else? And, I think that's really important. I was quite young when I lost my dad. I was sort of 18 and actually that dragged on for a long time. He was kind of terminally ill for quite a few years, I suppose through my teenage years. And I think seeing somebody you care about gradually lose their life and lose that ability to do these things, for me was such a powerful thing early on in my career to see just how fragile and how quick we can be extinguished. That actually, making the most of every single moment is really, really important. I think for a long time, and I'm probably still to some extent, I go hell for leather a lot of the time, just fitting in as much as I can. I think that's maybe as I'm getting a little bit older, it's not that I'm slowing down. It's just that I find I find I can be at peace a little bit more with having more quiet moments, I guess. But so I think in terms of a core philosophy, I think making sure that we, as me as an individual, me as a leader, my team, my business, the projects that we get involved in are allowing us to, it's a bit corny, but live our best life. But it really is that, because sadly, we're not immortal and we're not going to be around forever. And actually, when we're gone, in the grand scheme of things, we're not going to have been that big of a deal in the universe. And so, I think making the most of life as we get to experience it is just massively important.
Thank you for sharing part of your story. It's very poignant and it's a great reminder. And I think many people have heard that, or they've had a wake-up call, but then they've fallen back asleep. Why do you think people don't generally think about these things, make the most of their lives? Why do people spend so much time worrying about small things, petty things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's very easy to do that. I think we're naturally wired up, we're looking for threats, all of those kind of. Yeah, I love neuroscience. I wouldn't say I'm any kind of expert, but I read lots of books and try and put into practice some of that stuff that you can learn these days. And I think we're habit forming creatures. And if over the years we formed certain habits, then it becomes very, very easy to lapse into those habits or just get stuck in a rut doing things that, aren't particularly mindful is a great word for that. Because I think until you consciously give some thought to that stuff, you could spend your whole life running autopilot, doing stuff that isn't necessarily fulfilling or whatever. I think the important thing actually is having that time, making that time to really review, look at what you're doing. And for me, that could just be 10 minutes in the morning on Headspace. It doesn't necessarily have to be a deep, meaningful, spiritual thing or anything like that, but just taking some time, I think, to reflect on what's really happening in the moment, not just, the crazy stuff that goes on in our brains that we call thoughts and think are super important. Because I think if one thing that, I've discovered through my own personal mindfulness journey and just journaling every day and taking some time to reflect is that, my goodness, some crazy stuff goes on in my brain. And if I paid attention to all of it, I don't think it'd be very healthy at all, And so I think just trying to get that little bit of distance between ourselves and our thinking is actually a really powerful way of then being able to make changes that are lasting. And then, I think if you get into like some of the neuroscience stuff and habits and all the rest of it, you can then begin to engineer good habits that help you move towards whatever it is that, you think is going to make you feel fulfilled and in some ways happy.
So you epitomize the thoughtful leader in the sense that you've learned to take a step back, reflect, you do your journaling, you're into mindfulness, which, it's not just a fad. It really works. It's worked for eons, for all the clever people and all the thoughtful leaders throughout history. So you're in a good club. And you use the word engineer right at the end. Is that your actual background? Are you quite technical, would you say?
Oh, well, no, I'm not by training at all. I think I'm naturally curious. And so I've always I was always taking apart toys as a kid and trying to figure out how they work and stuff like that. But no, I would say I'm more creative. I'm a communicator. I've always done sales and marketing and things like that. And I really enjoy that stuff. But I also enjoy engineering and figuring out how to make things work. I think what I will say is once I've figured out how it works, I lose interest quickly and want to go and figure out how something else works, which, I've got some very skilled engineers, software engineers and people like that, friends who, and on my team as well, and who, they figure out how something works and then they make it better and keep making it better and to the nth degree. Whereas, I think that I've kind of got that split personality where I'm probably more inclined to want to go and find the next bright, shiny thing to engineer and figure out. But I think, again, these are all important things to sort of reflect on in our personalities. I'm very lucky because I can find joy in engineering or creative things or all of that stuff. And I feel very blessed to have that sort of breadth of interest, really. But yeah, I think figuring out which bits of that you can do well and where you then fail on it is equally important. I guess that too is in some way engineering the way you live your life, which I think is the ultimate project we work on anyway.
Yes, how you live your life, the ultimate project. Yeah, I mean, I think you can call yourself an unqualified engineer. You are. You've got that engineer mentality, but it's more strategic engineer. Anyway, let me not play with words. One of my favorite things to do, what I want to do is understand how you manage a team of truly technical people, and they're not all the same as you. And I think a lot of the listeners have this challenge as well. We have diverse teams in many aspects, and we don't have a cookie cutter mold of ourselves in every role. So how do you manage people who are so different from you in terms of personality type or just the way they are?
Yeah, so that's a good. These are wonderful questions, Mindy. Thank you. There's a few things with that. So there's just kind of coming random thoughts out of my brain. I mean, the first thing is, I'm a massive believer in understanding each of us personalities. I'm very fortunate to be familiar with James Knight and his work with IMA. And, I think that's just such a powerful tool because, I know there are lots of sort of personality testing frameworks, things like that out there. What I love about IMA is, it's just so simple. Everybody gets a color and everybody can understand it really, really easy. So whenever I start to work with a team, I always make a point of doing that and sharing my color, because I think it was actually in a session I did with Penny Power a little while ago. We were talking about all of this stuff, and I had a real epiphany because, whilst it's so interesting to know a little bit more about how we work as individuals and how our own personalities sort of impact others and so on and so forth, actually understanding how those personalities can be overdone and sharing that with people, I think you've got to be reasonably vulnerable to do that, but it's one of the most powerful things that you can do. For example, I'm a high yellow, so anybody who's familiar with IMA, you could probably guess that anyway. But it just means there are certain traits to my personality, like I lose interest in a project reasonably quickly after I feel like I've added as much value as I can, and I want to go and find something cool and new and interesting and fun for me to go and do. Which, as a leader of a business, that could be disastrous, couldn't it? Because, you start an initiative and it's all great and you have all this input and then you sort of leave that. How are your team going to feel about that? How motivating is that going to be for your team? So I think by making your team aware that, listen, I might go off the boil a little bit because just the way I'm wired up. So we need to find ways for me to keep innovating and adding the value that I can help. And also knowing how everybody else in the team operates. And I've got greens and I've got blues and I've got reds in there as well. So, knowing that each of us have these strengths that can support one another is hugely, hugely important. And, it really can move a project along so much quicker once you have that understanding. I think the other thing, as far as your question is concerned, in particular with technical people, that's been a really interesting journey for me because somebody called me technical not so long ago. And I thought, I suppose I am technical now. That's what a bizarre label for me to realize that I've got, who knew, leading a technology-based business and having developed the platform myself. But I genuinely didn't view myself as an engineer, as a technical person, because, I just had an idea for an app and I struggled to communicate with developers because it's a sales and marketing thing. And so I thought, what the heck, I'll learn how to code and build it myself then. And so I just did. And that just seemed like an obvious way to solve that problem. And I guess in doing so, yes, I have become quite technical and quite skilled with some of that development kind of work. But within that lies a little bit of a problem because obviously, once we start to have some success and the little kooky thing that I managed to make, using Google and Stack Overflow, I then was able to hire truly technical people that have had proper training, gone to uni or whatever, learn and they've, experienced good computer science people. And in doing that, I've genuinely found some imposter syndrome, I guess is the only way to describe that, because despite having developed an app that's generated millions of dollars in revenue and done all these cool things, there's still a little part of me that was like, yeah, but I don't really, I'm kind of winged it. I kind of learned this stuff on the fly. I don't, some of it's not as great as if, I look at my code and it's not as well written as what these guys, and they know stuff I don't know. So they must be better than I am. And actually that was a real mistake that I made for a long time, because yes, they are way more skilled than I am at developing, but that doesn't mean some of the skills that I brought to and I bring to my business and massively, massively valuable. And I think, one thing I've had to realize is, although I'm not classically trained in developing, for want of a better word, I see things that my developer team just don't see sometimes. I'm always looking for the shortcut. I just want to get things done quickly. I connect dots in certain ways that they just don't do. Now, that doesn't mean I can actually physically connect those dots better than them. It's certainly not. And, what I've found is when I've got over myself a little bit and realized, actually, Mike, you need to lead this team. These, play the head chef role, if you like, because these guys are they're the skill, they're the talent. They're doing this stuff every day, breathing it. They're so fluent with these, they can do a better job, but I need to assemble the dish before it goes out to the customer. And so by kind of taking that mentality, it's made me feel a bit more comfortable. And, we've just this year, we're about to release the next evolution of our platform, and it's just going to be amazing. And that, I feel like, yes, I've had great input, and it's facilitated those technical guys to be able to do what they absolutely do best and build some amazing software for us. So I think in terms of that communication, it's just understanding that although you're not necessarily the most skilled craftsman in the room, as it were, or craftswoman, to be more politically correct, it doesn't mean that your input actually isn't vital to that project being successful, and is actually going to make it easier for those people to do their job as well as they need to. So a couple of things there.
A couple of important things. I wanted to pull on some of those threads in the limited time we have left. Let me just acknowledge your vulnerability, openness, self-awareness. There's a lot there, which is part of being a thoughtful leader. So listeners, I'm sure you've picked up on that, and it's encouraging and it's inspiring. So I just want to acknowledge Mike for, sharing his personality, color, whatever you want to call it, sharing his vulnerabilities with his team. If you're leading, now I'm speaking to all the listeners now, if you are leading a team, do you do that? Or do you think that you have to show up as the role model and not be perfect, but possibly, always put your best foot forward and not share anything that could be construed as a weakness? It's a rhetorical question, and I'm sure everybody knows that the way Mike is doing things is probably the way we all need to do it. It is scary, to be vulnerable in any situation, but especially a team that you're managing. If somebody thinks, oh, for goodness sakes, somebody's having a wobble at the top, maybe I better go elsewhere. These are tricky times. There's a lot of job openings, and I do believe it's an employee market. But let's go back to the other thing that Mike was talking about, and that's his own imposter syndrome, and is getting over that. And there's lots of reasons why leaders would have that. I guess operating in a field that you were not classically trained in, to use your phrase, you might wonder, what am I doing here? What's my role? But your role, as you say, is head chef. So that was all beautifully articulated, and I wanted to appreciate you. And listeners, if you've been listening to the show for a while, we get these insights usually embedded in one of the guests' answers. And if you've been subscribing for a while, you'll know that it's not always obvious, where the gems are going to come from. So I just really wanted to acknowledge and celebrate you, Mike, before I ask you the big, big question of all. And we only have a couple of minutes. So if you can think of something quickly, that would be great. I do ask some of our guests if there's a mistake you made or an error of judgment that it helped to build your character. It worked out okay, but at the time, you look back, and even now you can kind of feel the emotions. Would you be willing to share something like that?
Yeah, well, take your pick. I've got a long list of theirs. For sure. I'm sure I've got a few more to make before I get done. But I think one that particularly has had an impact on me, at least, is early on in my career, I was in sales, direct sales in particular. We used to run big call centers. It was all a bit Wolf of Wall Street-ified, but I learned some lessons and made some money. So I've no regrets. But, I think back then it was very easy, sort of the young Mike wanting to build this massive empire. And there was, huge ego behind how many people I was employing at any one time. And, I remember that when we hit 200 employees or 250 employees and 3 branches and, all of these things that at the time felt like that was a badge of honor in some way. And the profit is sanity and all of that stuff where we're making as much money as we could. Who knows? But certainly thinking just about how can I grow this business in terms of the people who work here was something that seemed very appealing. And I truly believe that came from a place of ego completely, because I used to be the guy who could stand up and rally the troops, and the more the merrier, that was wonderful. And seemingly we would make more money the more people that work there. The problem with that is that, some of those businesses are quite fragile, and they were quite fragile based on contracts, to make sales for a supplier who could pull that contract at a moment's notice. And that happened in particular in one of our businesses. We had one major contract making sales for that business. They pulled the plug within the space of a month, and they did it in quite an insidious way without actually making us aware that that's what they was doing. They just made it really hard to make sales for them. And the business just imploded. I remember vividly being in a position because, you got 200 people on the payroll. That's a big old overhead. And if all of a sudden somebody pulls a chair from underneath you, you very quickly, within a couple of months even, go from being in a good cash situation to being a very, very bad one, trying to dig yourself out of it. And I remember being in the awful situation where we realized we didn't have the cash in the bank to meet payroll, and having to tell people, I'm really sorry, but your wages are going to be delayed. And the impact that could make on a person who is relying on those wages to buy food and pay rent and all the stuff that they do was huge. And just awful, what an awful lesson, a way to learn that lesson for everybody concerned. And, I just remember thinking, do you know what, actually, I never want to be in that position again. It's, it's a position of trust when somebody comes to work for you. And therefore you need to be reasonably sure that you're going to be able to pay them at the end of the month, even if things, or you can do something to deal with that. And actually that really had an impact later on, because now I've no interest in building huge companies or anything like that. I don't want to build a corporate. I wouldn't be very good at it anyway, I've discovered. I'm much better with a small team that we can be nimble and agile and do cool stuff and move around. And I take a lot more fulfillment from that. And, so do the team. And ironically, it's probably a hell of a lot more profitable as well. So, lessons learned for sure.
Yeah, well, that resonated with me, having started and built and then dismantled a call center team. We'll have a chat offline about that. Yeah, the interesting thing is sometimes there are things outside of our control, and we do everything that we think is best. Okay, you admit you were coming from, a different kind of energy, but I'm sure you really did care about those folks, but you could not have predicted or controlled exactly what happened with that client. Oh, gosh, I wish we had another half an hour, 3 hours, but we don't. We keep these episodes short so that people can have a break, coffee break, water break, just enjoy, or have a half an hour to themselves, like Mike was talking about, just to take a step back, reflect on stuff. And if something has sparked your interest, you've got his bio there. Do connect with him, reach out to him, ask him any question. I know he'd be very happy to engage with you. But for now, I'm going to thank our guest, Mike Jones, for such an insightful interview. And I had no idea where it was going to go, as usual, which I love. Guests don't always, but you did very well. And thank you so much for sharing with us today, Mike.
Thank you for having me. Absolute pleasure.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Thoughtful Leader, and I hope it's inspired you to be more thoughtful as a leader in your business. Please consider subscribing and leaving a review. An important question for you. Do you want to create a culture of thought leadership in your organization? My best-selling book, The Thoughtful Leader, is available now on Amazon and many other sites in paperback, ebook, and audiobook formats. Please visit www.mindygk.com for more great content. That's www.mindygk.com. Speak to you again soon.